Not everybody who's born in the United States is automatically a citizen. They stopped easily giving out US passports to people who were born in Texas or Arizona near the Mexican border. There are expedited citizenship procedures if you join the military. Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be discussing some ways that you can become a citizen aside from just applying for naturalization. We're going to be going through some unique examples, and I bet you that you'll learn some stuff you didn't know. The most obvious way that you can become a citizen is by applying for naturalization. I've done several videos that do a deep dive into this, so if you want to learn more about applying for naturalization, check out those videos. But just to briefly summarize, you generally need to be a permanent resident and have your green card for 5 years before you're eligible to apply. Unless you've been married to a US citizen, in which case you typically only need to be a permanent resident for 3 years. One of the most common ways that people derive citizenship is by being born in the United States. But not everybody who's born in the United States is automatically a citizen. There are some rare situations where you might not be a citizen even though you were born in the US. For example, if you are the child of a diplomat and you're born while your parents are here as diplomats to the United States, you are actually not a US citizen when you're born. You can apply for permanent residence at almost any time, but I actually have a very sad situation that I recently dealt with along these lines. Somebody was in the US, they were born here, and they thought they were a US citizen their whole lives. In fact, after they began working, they've declared that they were a US citizen on all these employment forms, which unfortunately turns out to be a false claim to US citizenship, which is very difficult and oftentimes impossible to ever fix. He's had a social security number his whole life, he has a US birth certificate, driver's license, all the documents that you would need. But then he applies for a US passport and actually gets the passport. But a year later, the Department of State revokes the passport and sent him a letter saying, "Our records indicate that you were the child of this person, a US diplomat, at the time you were born." So now he's stuck in the US without status. It's an interesting situation because he has all the documentation that most state agencies would require, such as the US birth certificate, the social security number, but if he ever tries to leave the US, he won't be allowed back in, and he can't get a US passport. So that's a really rare situation, but worth mentioning because a lot of people deal with that situation. Another situation I've dealt with is when somebody was born very close to the Texas-Mexico border. So they were actually born in Texas, very close to Mexico. And when they were born, around 30 years ago, it was very common for your birth to be registered by a midwife and not a hospital. And so I was representing this client and trying to get him a US passport. And the Department of State said, "Our records don't clearly prove that you were born in a US hospital. These midwife certificates that are evidence of your birth can be easily faked. And there are all these fraudulent cases of midwife certifications indicating that someone was born in the US that turned out to be false." So they stopped easily giving out US passports to people who were born in Texas or Arizona near the Mexican border. And they required us to jump through a bunch of hoops. And it was very strange actually. They asked us for evidence that the child went to school in the US and other stuff like that to basically say, like, show us that your client is American enough. You know, whether you go to school in the US doesn't really have that much to do with whether you were born in the US. You can be born in the US and immediately leave and go to school in Mexico, but you're still a US citizen. So that was a bit of a weird situation that I thought I would mention. Another way to derive citizenship is to be born abroad, but to US citizen parents. And I get questions about this all the time. A US citizen is abroad with his immigrant spouse and they have a child. And the US citizen asks me, how do I petition for my spouse and child to come into the US? And my answer oftentimes is you have to file a family petition for your spouse, but actually your child's a US citizen. Just file this form with the US consulate in the country where your child is living. It's called a consular report of birth abroad. You file it with the consulate, they will register the child's birth, and then you can just apply for a US passport for the child so that the child can enter with the parent when the immigrant spouse finally gets approved for an immigrant visa and is able to enter the United States. I get a lot of questions about this. You can find a lot of the information about consular reports of birth abroad through the Department of State's website, or if you have any specific questions about it, you could always feel free to reach out to my office. One final way that I'm going to discuss for becoming a citizen is through military naturalization provisions. I had a client who married a US citizen in the US and got a conditional green card. And if you're not new to my channel, you know that when you get a conditional green card, 2 years later, approximately, you need to apply to remove the conditions on your residency. And I'll typically schedule it in my calendar to call my clients up like a year and a half later to remind them and to see if they need assistance with the process. I called this client up a year and a half later after he got his conditional green card and I said, hey, we need to start thinking about applying to remove the conditions on your green card. And he says to me, no, that's fine. I don't need to do it. I'm already a US citizen. And I said, hey, how'd you do that? And he said, oh, I actually immediately joined the Army and they helped me apply for naturalization. And there are expedited citizenship procedures if you join the military. This was actually new to me at the time. I don't really represent people in their military naturalization applications, and it's for a good reason. It's because the military has like a legal hotline and they will assist you with the process if you join the military as a permanent resident. Interestingly, even if you're the spouse of a military member, let's say you have a husband and you're the wife and your husband's in the military and stationed abroad at a US military base. If you receive authorization to join them abroad, there are some ways where you can actually expedite your own naturalization if you're a resident when you go to reside with them abroad. Also interestingly, let's say you spend like 11 months with your spouse at a military base abroad, and then you enter the US. There are some situations where those 11 months abroad can count towards your physical presence requirements for naturalization in the US. Like if you need to show that you've been physically present in the US for 3 years, those 11 months might actually count towards that under some circumstances. Another way that a lot of people become US citizens is by residing in the US as children who are permanent residents, and then their parents, who are also permanent residents, apply for naturalization. If your parents naturalize and become a US citizen while you're living with them in their custody and you meet other requirements, then you will automatically become a citizen on the day that they become a citizen. But you will not have a certificate of naturalization or a certificate of citizenship. You can apply for a US passport, and oftentimes you just need to show that your parents naturalized before you reached the age of 18 and that you were living with them in their custody at the time. And you'll get a US passport, which most people think is definitive proof that they are a US citizen. That's not always the case. When that child reaches the age of 18, and I rarely see this happen, but some people do it, they can apply for a certificate of citizenship. And it's very similar to applying for a certificate of naturalization. And interestingly, they still make you go into a swearing-in ceremony to take an oath of citizenship, which I always found really strange and illogical because they are already a US citizen. They don't need to take any oath. They're already a citizen, just applying for a piece of paper, which by the way is very expensive, to prove that they're a citizen. All right, guys, so that wraps up my video on some common and not so common ways that people naturalize or prove that they are a US citizen. If you have specific questions about this topic, put it in the comments below. Within a few days of each new video posting, I will answer every comment or question that you guys post. But beyond that, I can't guarantee it because we are very busy right now. If you're new to my channel, be sure to like and subscribe. I put out videos on a weekly basis, and I'll see you guys next week for another video.